What do we really know about the era of the ancient Egyptians? Well, one thing can be said with certainty: the pharaohs left us a series of gigantic riddles. And that is meant quite literally, since we can't even say how the Egyptians were able to pile up their tons of heavy stone blocks to create such huge, perfectly aligned marvels as the pyramids. The ancient megastructures are still accompanied by many exciting speculations. But the ancient Egyptian mysteries extend far beyond the magnificent buildings on the Giza plateau. For example, what about the colossal labyrinth mentioned by Herodotus and others, which, according to the descriptions, was nothing less than one of the most impressive structures of all time? How did the ancient Egyptians manage to transport dozens of gigantic sarcophagi, some weighing up to 100 tons, into the Serapeum? And why were they completely empty when they were rediscovered? And above all, was a supernatural being really buried in the tomb of Osiris? We have decoded the genome. We have conquered diseases that once meant certain death. And we are looking deeper than ever into the secrets of the universe with technological masterpieces like the James Webb Telescope. And yet, despite all this, we are unable to understand how people managed to build an oversized pile of stones 4,500 years ago. Okay, admittedly, this sharp-tongued formulation probably doesn't do full justice to the mystery surrounding the ancient Egyptian pyramids, and yet we still can't say with absolute certainty how the ancients managed to build their stone colossuses out of the ground in detail. Conservative historians point to the ingenious combinations of ramps, rope devices, and sheer muscle power. But given that the Great Pyramid consists of around 2.65 million stone blocks, some of which weigh up to 70 tons and were quarried 800 kilometers away, the alternative camp believes it is more likely that we are dealing with the result of a lost advanced technology. And where the idea of simple hammering and chiseling has been abandoned, the actual purpose of the Great Pyramid is also massively questioned. According to the current doctrine, it is the final resting place of the pharaoh Cheops, and this despite the fact that the structure is so different from the typical tombs of its time. Specifically, no mystical funerary texts or precious grave goods, let alone a royal mummy, have been found here. All that has been brought to light so far at the heart of the Great Pyramid was a granite ball, a hook, and some pieces of cedar wood. Incidentally, the wood fragments were rediscovered by chance in the Museum of Aberdeen a few years ago, and subsequent analysis revealed that they are not 4,500 years old at all, but over 5,000 years old. In other words, the wood is half a millennium older than the pyramid itself. But how can that be? Well, either the material was so rare and precious back then that it was reused for centuries, or it shows us that we were way off base with the original age dating of the Great Pyramid. But perhaps the answers to all the open pyramid questions are still hidden in the belly of the stone giant. You may well remember how, in early 2023, researchers tracked down a previously unknown chamber in the Great Pyramid of Giza. And while the original purpose of the 9-meter-long and 2.3-meter-high cavity is still completely unknown, the question of what lies behind it is even more significant for experts. Because there is one thing we must not forget. Despite the fact that this architectural wonder has been towering on the Giza plateau for thousands of years, only 10% of the Great Pyramid of Giza has been explored so far. Where missing bowls become a problem. And who knows, maybe something like an instruction manual is hidden in the pyramid, explaining how the monumental structure can be switched on. Yes, you heard right, because assuming that enigmatic illustrations such as the light bulbs of Dendera actually show fully functional high-tech machines, many an alternative mind considers it conceivable that the Great Pyramid of Giza is in fact a gigantic power plant. This is an admittedly surprising interpretation, but it also does not stop at the Serapeum in Saqqara. Officially, however, we are dealing here with an underground Apis bull tomb, which was built at the behest of Chimawesset around 1250 BC. But while the pyramids of Giza have been visible to everyone on the Giza plateau for at least 4,500 years, in this case, it took until the 1850s for the archaeological treasure to be awakened from its long slumber. The rediscovery of the Serapeum is attributed to the French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette. and he was amazed when he saw the 24 huge granite sarcophagi in the underground complex. However, Marriott was even more astonished when he saw that most of the lids had been pushed to the side, and that every trace of their contents was missing. And let's be clear about this. According to the experts, each stone monster weighs between 70 and 80 tons, complete with the 20 to 30 ton lids. But the matter becomes even more astounding when we consider that the granite boxes do not consist of countless individual parts. They were always carved out of a single block. However, since the Apis bulls were considered the embodiment of the creator god Ptah in ancient Egypt, this elaborate form of burial may have been in keeping with their extraordinary status. But why is there actually no trace of the sacred animals? Well, the long-established researchers explain this with the work of Coptic monks who once entered the Serapeum and destroyed the bull mummies to put an end to the cult of Apis. But how the rioting brothers in faith managed to drag the animal corpses through the narrow crevices is another matter entirely. Incidentally, the same also applies to the question of why they even bothered to push the lid back on the sarcophagus in one case. While Marriott explored the Serapeum, one coffin was still closed, and since the Egyptologist and his companions were unable to move the massive lid by hand, they ultimately had to blow a hole in the granite box to reveal the interior. However, this sarcophagus was also empty, or should we say, this battery. As already mentioned, the Serapeum is also suspected in certain circles of being something quite different from what our history books lead us to believe. Accordingly, we would also have to deal here with the lost technology of antiquity, and with a technology that served the artificial generation of light. A pretty far-out theory, but it still sounds far less disturbing than the idea that monstrous creatures, such as the biblical Nephilim, were once locked away in the Serapeum. The mysteries of the Osiris tomb. Not even the god of the dead is safe from death. Although Osiris was considered the ruler of the afterlife in ancient Egyptian mythology, he was murdered and dismembered by his own brother, Seth. Fortunately for the deceased, he had a wife, Isis, who collected his scattered remains and brought him back to life. So far, so supernatural. But in truth, belief in the gods was so firmly anchored in the culture of the ancient Egyptians that they even dedicated an entire tomb complex to Osiris. This is hidden under the desert floor of the Giza plateau and was brought back to light by Salim Hassan in 1933. But, strictly speaking, this sensational find could actually have been made much earlier. Well, if only we had believed the accounts of ancient historians, that is. Herodotus actually described the mystical tomb of the gods as early as 430 BC in his second book of histories. The ancient Greek mentioned in detail that there is an artificial lake in the lowest level of the complex, complete with an island where Pharaoh Cheops was buried. And lo and behold, the deepest chamber of the Osiris tomb is indeed dripping wet, and also contains a sarcophagus, which, in the best Serapeum tradition, is completely empty. But even if we ignore the missing mummies, a fundamental question arises. Why is the tomb called the Osiris tomb if, according to Herodotus, Cheops was buried here? As is well known, the king already had a very special, not exactly modest tomb in the form of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Well, perhaps this is the reason why most researchers, contrary to Herodotus' statements, cling to the idea that we are dealing here with a symbolic tomb for the mighty god of the dead. At the same time, however, the experts do not know what the cramped shaft, which is just 40 by 40 centimeters in size, can be reached via the eastern wall of the Osiris burial chamber is all about. It apparently leads east towards the Sphinx. Where is the labyrinth hidden? Given that Herodotus' statement about the Osiris tomb were ultimately confirmed by reality, the question arises as to whether we are really well advised to simply relegate his reports of the monumental labyrinth to the realms of myths and legends. After all, the ancient historian was by no means the only one to report the existence of this legendary structure. In fact, Herodotus is said to have personally marveled at the stunning complex during his trip to Egypt. But just listen for yourself. Quote, "I have seen the labyrinth, which surpasses everything that has been said about it. If one were to take all the similar walls and other buildings in Greece, they would not equal the cost and labor expended on this one labyrinth. The pyramids, of course, defy description, and each of them is the equal of many of the great works of the Greeks. But the labyrinth surpasses even the pyramids. At the same time, Herodotus reported that the labyrinth had 12 covered courtyards with gates on the opposite sides, and that it was enclosed by a single wall. Furthermore, the structure had a whopping 3,000 rooms, which were divided equally into above-ground and underground chambers. However, during his visit to the labyrinth, Herodotus was only allowed to see the chambers above ground. The Greek only heard stories about the underground chambers where the sacred crocodiles and the kings were buried. The situation was somewhat different in the case of the huge pyramid and the so-called Lake Moeris, on the banks of which the labyrinth was located. And while Herodotus described the site as an almost superhuman work that would have easily made the list of ancient wonders of the world, the question arises as to why there is no trace of the labyrinth today. Well, but is there any at all? In 2008, the members of the Maharara expedition suspected the location of the structure to be in Harara. And indeed, they discovered an extensive site at a depth of 10 meters, which had huge chambers, large halls, and meter-thick walls. The experts then published their exciting research results in a scientific journal and presented them at the University of Ghent. But, mysteriously, nothing more has happened since then. The site has not been professionally investigated since 2008, so we still don't know the exact background to this remarkable find. What we can tell you today, however, is the exact background to the subscribe button. Feel free to click subscribe now so you never miss a new video from us again. See you soon!